So let's talk to first Mila in Colorado, pronouns are she, her, who wants to talk about biological sex classifications. So, Mila, you are live on Transatlantic with Arden and Josie. What's going on?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for calling.
Sorry. Yeah, of course. Sorry, I get a little nervous.
No worries.
If I sound a little shaky in my voice, that's why. So I wanted to talk about biological sex classification because I would agree with what some gender criticals and J.K. Rowling says as far as biological sex is real. I would disagree on the point that biological sex is the only thing that matters, but I do think biological sex is real. And
Sure.
because I think it's real, I think that's why we can't deny biology that's universally female, right? Because it's the same biological mechanism happening, whether these phenotypic traits are being expressed in a trans woman or in a cis woman or an intersex woman. It's the same morphological pattern, right? And that leads me to my question, which is, should we be prioritizing natural developmental pathways, or should we be prioritizing developmental outcomes? Because I think the reason why trans people are so unfairly and objectively inaccurately described as biological males, when, if you say a trans woman isn't a biological female because her biology isn't perfectly 100% aligned with endosexual female biology. Endosexual is the opposite of intersex. So it just means 100% alignment. But if you make that argument by that same logic, then based on the developmental outcome, you can no longer classify her as a biological male either because, especially once you remove the thing that creates gametes, right? Once you remove reproductive organs and you change phenotypic, a trans woman's biology is no longer 100% aligned with endosexual male biology either. So depending on the extent, right? So you can't, if there's only two sexes and there's male and female, then my opinion is you have to go based on dominant morphological alignment.
So I'm trying to get to your question. Sorry, I hear what you're saying. Of course, Arden and I both agree that biological sex is real. I don't know many trans people who deny that fact in reality. The fact that I was assigned male at birth, and I identify as a woman is what makes me trans. So just the fact that I say I'm a trans woman is a complete application to the point that there is a difference between gender and sex. That's why I am trans. So what is the question?
The question is, should we be defining biological sex classification based on developmental outcomes or the natural developmental pathway? Let me give an example, right? If someone needs a heart surgery, right? Or a heart transplant, their natural developmental pathway would be that they would die of a heart attack or a kidney failure, or say they're type 1 diabetic, right? If they eat a chocolate cake, right? And they have chronically high insulin levels, right? The natural developmental pathways, they would be blind. But because of modern medicine, right? The developmental outcome is they can retain their vision. The developmental outcome is that with a heart transplant or a kidney transplant, they can be alive. But if we go with gender critical standards, then we should be classifying them as biologically dead. So
Josie, you go first, but I think we get the question. Josie, if you want to jump in, I do have thoughts I want to share.
Yeah. So we have to realize that I think what you're, and I will distinguish a little bit, is modern medicine will tell you, right, that sorry, my chat just went out. I just want to get that going. Sorry about that. So, modern medicine is about developmental outcomes in a lot of ways. Like you were talking about the heart transplant, you were talking about insulin and all of those type of things. We want people to be able to live, and therefore we do medical science on those individuals to make sure that they have outcomes that are better for their quality of life. So for it's the same with trans people. If we know that a person is trans and that person knows that they're trans and they are caught at an early age, and therefore we can block.
One second.
I get a lot of feedback.
Yeah, do you have the show on in the background, Mila?
Oh, no, I don't. Oh, I have you on speakerphone. Should I take you off speaker?
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you so much.
No worries.
No worries. So,
okay, is this better?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So to finish the point here is, when I look at the outcomes of a transition, for example, I am looking for letting a person be able to have a better quality of life, period, right? Some trans people don't take the standard transition that a lot of people take. Some people only want, breast augmentation. Some people don't want hormones at all. Some people want hormones and no surgical intervention. Some people, there's so many different ways that people, choose their own adventure when it comes to the way that they feel relieves a lot of the distress and dysphoria that a person may have when they seek medical transition, since we're talking about medical transition specifically right now. So I'm going to focus on the quality of life of that person. So if we find out early that they know before puberty that they are trans, then we should give that person the medical pathways to be able to block puberty and go through the puberty that will make them feel more at ease with the body that they have. So more than just developmental outcome, I look at it even more broadly than developmental outcome. I'm looking for quality of life outcome. So as a researcher that does research on trans people, I'm going to be focusing more on quality of life than I am with this is the cookie cutter transition that you should get to get this developmental outcome, unless that person wants that specific thing. Right. If the person is like, I want this XY developmental outcome in my transition, then doctors have every right and should provide that basic medical care to make sure that they get that developmental outcome, versus the way that a lot of gender critical people say is like, no, you must suffer and go through the puberty that you were assigned at birth. So therefore, then you can change things later on. I think it's always, if we center the person's quality of life, you're going to get a better result across the board, regardless of what stage somebody's in.
Yeah, I would agree with that for the most part. Like, as far as, because I think everyone agrees on that, right? Like, and obviously she's saying this in the most condescending way, but J.K. Rowling will say, dress how you please, whatever. But when it comes to like sex segregated spaces, like bathrooms, locker rooms, prisons where trans people are, if they're put in the wrong prison system and they have anatomy that can experience the same sexual assault that any other woman can be assaulted with, right? Like, quality of life matters, of course. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that, like, when it comes to how we categorize people into sex segregated spaces, it's, I think, really important also to prioritize like these developmental outcomes, because, someone can have a higher quality of life. That doesn't necessarily mean that they should be reclassified as a biological female in principle, right? But like, if a person has a dominant morphological alignment with female biology, meaning that, like, all right, on a species level, sure, like, biological sex classification is that if you produce large gametes, you're a biological female, right? But why do we consider women who don't produce gametes or are intersex, let's say, with XY chromosomes? We still consider them biological female because even though they don't produce the gametes, the dominant morphology.
Sorry, finish.
Sorry?
No, go ahead.
So we classify them as biological female because all the other biological systems that are sexually dimorphic in their body are oriented around the production of large gametes. And when someone goes through a certain point of medical transition, they no longer produce any gametes. They no longer have reproductive biology that produces those. And they, especially if you go through the changes before puberty, like you you end up reaching the outcome where the majority of your biological systems are aligned with the production of large gametes, even though your natural developmental pathway might have been to produce small gametes. And I think that's a really important consideration when, we classify certain trans women, when we classify them based on biological sex to determine whether or not they belong in sex segregated spaces.
So if I can jump in,
please. Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. I appreciate. I know you. I think you said last time you called in that you were like a geneticist or something. So I appreciate that you bring like a lot of scientific knowledge to this topic. I think what you're touching on is something that on TACUS, we've joked about how there are levels to the gender critical argument with regard to biological sex. Like level 1, introductory biological essentialist says penis and vagina, that's male and female. Level 2, they're going to talk about chromosomes, XX and XY. Level 3, they're going to say it's your gamete size. It's small gametes or large gametes. But level 4, and this is kind of what you're touching on, and this is why I would say I don't actually think you agree with J.K. Rowling, because she said a lot more than just what you brought up here. And when she says the things that she says, they're very loaded. There's like so many articles detailing. There's a great one by Hemant Mehta that I highly recommend everyone go read on J.K. Rowling and her whole history. But what we often call this last level, what you're talking about, is where they sort of create a like scientific soul in their mind, because it's about it's not about having the large or small gamete. It's about having biology organized around the intention of producing large or small gametes, which falls back into absurdity, right? Like, what does it mean for your biology to have the intention of doing X, Y, or Z? Like, I think in some part, a really good faith interpretation is what you're talking about, where it's this notion of like the uninterrupted developmental pathway would have resulted in this. But it's like, it's not just medicine and intervention that disrupts these pathways. Biology disrupts these pathways all the time. And that's how we have intersex people in the first place. And I think that's where we start to get into the absurdity of the whole, like, the organized around the production of gametes argument. That's what I think of it as more like their effort to sort of construct this like male and female soul, but make it sound sciencey.
And I'm totally coming out of this from like a gender affirming perspective, right? Or a biological, sexually affirming perspective, where I would say that like, I completely agree. It's absurd. But also I think that the science would be on your side as far as like, look, gender critical people love to talk about the sexual dimorphism of every single aspect of the body, whether it is anatomy, physiology, secondary sexual characteristics. But the one thing that they refuse to acknowledge is sexually dimorphic is brain development. And yes, it's dimorphic on a spectrum, like many other things. But at the end of the day, like when something falls completely outside the standard deviation of male average patterns of brain development, and in the 50th percentile, directly in the middle of the standard deviation, which is what studies show when you look at regions of the brain like the BSCC, when you look at interconnectivity between hemispheres in the brain versus like interconnectedness between the hemispheres. I might have butchered it can get a little complex, but like I would say neurological congruence. Like if you develop a morphology of brain development that is organized around large gametes and your reproductive system is developed around small gametes, that's a very real aspect of sexual incongruence, just as we would say the same thing for like gonad incongruence if you have both ovaries and testes, which happens.
Sure. So Mila, I just want to jump in really quick, and my question is more because I work in policy, I work in politics, I work in like the sphere of like human rights and trying to make sure that, like you said, specifically is like coming in and the gender affirming angle of this conversation. So my question is I guess more more tactile to like the consequence. So if we had let's say we adopted your view on this, how would that affect people going into prisons? How would that affect people going into like gyms and locker rooms? Would your worldview affect that differently than the way that, let's say, yeah, go ahead.
No, I appreciate the question. I think it would, because I think it would classify certain trans women who've gone through a certain point of medical transition as, you know, to fitting the criteria of belonging in a sex segregated female space by saying, well, we already create an exception. We already acknowledge that intersex females are a valid variation of a biological female. No, they're not endosexual females. Yes, they may have some male development that was natural, but I would argue that whether that developmental pathway is, I don't even like the word natural, right? Because it's like medical transition is natural. You're going based off of the body's natural genetic blueprint for male or female phenotypic expression. Let's go with organic, right? Like organic developmental pathway versus, I would say that if we include intersex women, regardless of their complex female biology, because we say, well, that's a natural developmental pathway they had no choice in, I would make the argument that, you know, a medical outcome, while it might not be like quote unquote organic or natural, it is still equally valid, just as if someone's born with a cleft palate or someone is born deaf. And, you know, if
I hear you. So I'm gonna ask you a hypothetical, because these two things happen in the prison system currently. So it's actually a pretty high bar that prisons actually have for admitting a trans person into prisons. In fact, I would even argue that the bar is too high. So, for example, let's say this: there's a trans person, let's say a trans woman, and they have socially been living as a trans person. They've done, you know, some medical transition items, but not all of them, no surgical care, but they have been living their lives as trans persons, let's say 5+ years. They commit a crime that requires them to go to a state prison. And the judge has to make the determination that this person needs to go to prison. What prison would you send that person to? And that's all you have the evidence of. You don't have the ability to do a brain scan. You don't have the ability to do chromosome checks. All you have is the criminal record. You have the evidence of them living as you know, themselves, as identifying as a trans woman for, you know, several years. That is the evidence that you're given, and you're the judge presiding, and you know that this person's guilty. That's happening, but the sentencing is happening, and you have to choose which prison that they go to. In this scenario, how would you determine that?
So I would say that under no circumstances would I ever send a trans woman to a male prison, right? Like, whether they belong in a segregated part of the whether they belong in a segregated part of the female prison system, like, I would say
that's solitary confinement, though. That's already been seen as a human rights violation.
No, and I agree, and I wouldn't. I'd say that's a complex question to answer, and I don't know.
The reason I bring it up really quickly is because J.K. Rowling would say that person absolutely belongs in a male prison, and there's no way in hell that I would ever let them in there. Yeah, right.
And I would say that is absurd because, go ahead.
Well, the reason I say that is because that position is very clear across, you know, regardless of how we look at. I understand you're coming at it from a good faith, and I appreciate you saying that person doesn't belong in a male prison. I really do. But the idea of then creating a separation between the female inmate population and this person, I feel, is also a stretch. But I think, Arden, you were going to say something.
I was just going to add that, like, I think I agree with you in principle, Mia. I think the problem, and what Josie's touching on to like kind of bridge this, is that in practice, it's really difficult often to, like, you know, on an evaluation of an individual determining, you know, what would be the best fit for them, like, even if like you're saying, oh, well, they shouldn't go to a male prison, but maybe female prison isn't totally right. Well, I think it would be great to, in theory, have like some third wing that's not solitary confinement that could be available. I don't think trans people make up a sufficient portion of the population, even in prison, to justify the state spending money on developing these entire separate wings, right? So I think the result is often that things like solitary confinement come up, which is kind of the problem. But I agree with you in principle. I think we're very aligned on like, you know, the nuances of biology and the ways biology can change, and that, you know, putting trans women with men would be just overtly harmful to those trans women, with really not protecting women in any meaningful way at all.
I would make one distinction, which is that like I because the thing is like I do believe that they're like a person's brain biology is innate, right? Like that is if I can make an analogy with, say, someone that has like incongruent gonads or genitalia, right? Let's say you have two sets of twins that are they have the same sexual incongruence, right? There's obviously a debate like in the deaf community of like, hey, is being deaf a disability, you know, or is it like a superpower? Like, and this really comes down to it whenever it comes to like cochlear implants, right? Like a lot of people think that like, a lot of deaf people think that like cochlear implants are like, I think they have a very similar perspective to gender criticals, which is like, they prioritize acceptance over alignment. So like, you know, gender criticals would say, hey, like the brain isn't sexually dimorphic. If your brain is in a female body, then you have a female brain. If your brain is in a male body, you have a male brain, right? Like, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I do think it matters when it comes to answering this prison question, right? Because do we go with the biology that makes us human, that like we experience, or do we go with the biology that like fundamentally objectifies us, right? So the reason I bring up the deaf community is because I would say that like, you know, the same way that we would look at one, we wouldn't criticize either one of the twins. If there was one deaf twin that says, I want a cochlear implant because I prioritize alignment with, or I guess I prioritize being able to hear, no one would criticize that twin. But also no one would criticize the twin and say, well, you're invalid for wanting to seek acceptance and not like change your developmental pathway. Same thing with like ambiguous genitals. We can say, hey, we all know that like someone can be born with ambiguous genitalia, ambiguous like gonad structures. But we wouldn't say that, oh, that person like should be you know, that, you know, if the twin said, hey, you know, you're invalidating my acceptance because you're choosing to go through surgery and align your body with like one biological sex, no one would criticize that twin. But gender criticals all the time will criticize someone who has neurological incongruence, that, you know, their brain structure doesn't align with the biology of the rest of their body.
This is where I like, as far as my sociological political science part starts to kick in here, because, you know, regardless of the cochlear implants that you're talking about, yes, I have heard about that, but the thing is, it's like the person has the free will of choice, right? If a person wants to go to that surgery so they can, you know, join the hearing community, then they have the right to do so. Just like you said, we wouldn't criticize someone who decides to not go through that surgery, just like we would just with the trans community. I understand the congruence there. The issue that I start getting at is like when we start to like go down and medicalize, and I know I'm one of the different hosts on the show, because I know a lot of hosts like getting into like the biology of it and like getting into like the cellular things. But for me, it's like, I always think about like the brain body map distinction and like a gendered brain, all of that type of stuff as interesting facts. Like, I just like, okay, that's cool, but it doesn't change the fact that we can't go into people's brains and to decide what they should or shouldn't be. That is where
let me connect that. No, I totally respect that, and I think that's a really important. I think that's a really important counterbalance to the medicalization argument, because, you know, PTSD, depression, like autism, we don't do brain scans. Even if we can't understand the causal mechanisms of these conditions, we can ultimately say that like, hey, there's a diagnostic criteria
Right.
And,
it's clinical.
Right. And that's critical. And look, like before we coded the human genome, we understood that genetics was a thing. Before we understood the causal mechanisms of plate tectonics, we had empirical and observational evidence. So I don't think we have, and the brain science isn't like completely conclusive. Like we can't look at a brain and say this is pink and this is blue, right? Like it does get complicated. So I appreciate the critical feedback you're giving, because I do think it's important. If you let me, I would love to just kind of connect it and to kind of my overall point, right?
Yes, but I just want to add one thing. We have been on this call for like 20 plus minutes, so I do want to start to put a button on it because we do have full lines. But totally. If you want to, as long as you can be concise and start to put a button on it, I'm happy to let you tie it all together.
Absolutely. So here's what I would say. Ultimately, sorry, I'm not trying to delay. I'm just trying to make sure I don't ramble and I can give a concise.
No worries.
The way I would connect it is by saying that, listen, like whether it's a brain scan or whether we're looking at specifically cognitive patterns, it's not just like, like you would say that a man is emotional, so he's a woman. No, it's not that. It's that men and women do objectively, on average, process their emotions based on different cognitive patterns. They also form memories based on different cognitive patterns. They interact socially based on different cognitive patterns. And if we can create an objective diagnostic criteria to, not just gender dysphoria, which I think is the symptom, but get to the root cause, which is neurological incongruence, I do think there's a case to be made that we can segregate prisons based off of brain sex, but then where biological distinctions do come into play, like when it comes to anatomy and when it comes to like hormone profiles and stuff, then we can like dive into the minutia there. Just to like wrap it up with one more analogy. I know I love my analogies, but like, a gender critical person would say, well, if you have a brain in a female body, it's a female brain. Well, by their logic, if we could, in say the year 2050, do a brain transplant and we could put a male brain and transplant it into a female body, then like, would a gender critical person finally like say, oh, I guess now you can biologically change your sex?
No.
Or would they say, well, no, you still have a male brain. So either way, they have to compromise on something. That's why I think it's important to acknowledge neurological incongruencies and the science of brain sex.
I agree. The only thing I want to leave you off with, and I think you assuaged most of my concerns with that last little tie-in about how, like, even if we could transplant our brains into another body, they wouldn't still accept it. Was I think you maybe are on occasion a little too charitable to gender criticals. I think there are some who often call into the show who I agree are honest people who are just operating on an outdated model. However, I would say a lot of the people who are actively engaging in the gender critical space, J.K. Rowling and all of the subsidiary cliques within the gender critical movement are far more dishonest and actively working to misrepresent and attack. I appreciate you. I always want to approach everyone as if they're sincere with their claims, but when J.K. Rowling says she really thinks, wear whatever you want and, date whoever will have you, I don't think she fucking means that. And I think there's lots of good reason to believe that she's being dishonest about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to leave you with this.
Sure.
Oh yeah, we definitely.
I'm not in any way a fan.
No worries, we gotcha.
Yeah, no worries, and we're not trying to accuse you of that. I will say this, and maybe this is where I would leave you with this call, and maybe you can do a little bit more research as well. Is about the classifications of how we deal with spaces in particular, because that's where the conversation started as well, about people's uncomfortability of like people going into, women's spaces or female prisons or things like that. And just understand that when a judge is doing these things for, let's say, a woman prison, they are looking at a host of factors. If somebody's going to prison because they're a shoplifter, Like, I don't think the judge is like, oh my gosh, this person's going to commit rape once they're in prison, right? Like, it's like, you know, it's like one of those things where we need to really think about how the criminal justice system accounts for these things, right? Just like if a male was, let's say, homosexual and is a rapist, right? They would be like, hey, by the way, this person's criminal records, like maybe we need to have some more, you know, observance of this person to make sure that they're not going to do more atrocities in prison and things like that. Like, the criminal justice system is incredibly complex, and there's a lot there. And there's a lot of injustices that are happening currently to trans people as well. Like in the state of Florida, they'll buzz your hair and send you to a prison or to a jail just because you're like waiting for prison sentences. Like, it's like, as a trans person. So there's a lot of injustices there. And also, I would look into the fact that a trans person is more likely to get abused and assaulted in a male space, like you said about the male prison, in a male space than they are in a woman's space. In fact, even trans people are more in danger in going into women's spaces nowadays because they're going to be assaulted and abused by cis women as well. So
Agreed.
I think, yeah. So I think that
and that's why I say that's
conversations,
the last place I would put them in like a male prison.
Exactly.
Like that's the last. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would just look at the kind of like more along the lines, not just like the transness of it all, but the humanity of it all. And I think when you take a look at it in that lens, I think it's easier for people to be like, yeah, we should be kind and considerate to humans. And we should really be weighing ourselves on that. And that's why I always talk about the quality of life of things, because if you're a political actor and you're doing legislation, you should be focusing on quality of life, I think, as a first principle when you are trying to pass legislation. You know, I think that's incredibly important to look at that. But yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mila. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You too.
All right.
Hey, if you liked that clip, you'd love the whole thing. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, patreon.com/calltheline. That one sucked. Use it.